My name is Rachel Mercer. And last Thanksgiving, my brother-in-law handed my father a folder across the dinner table that changed everything my family thought they knew about the man they'd spent 6 years treating like a god. I should start earlier than that, though. I should start with the night my mother pulled me into the kitchen at my sister's engagement party and whispered, with a glass of champagne in her hand and tears in her eyes, that she was so proud of Leah, so proud. And then she looked at me, standing there in my blue dress, and said, "I just hope you find someone like Brandon someday, sweetheart. Someone who really has it together." My husband, Daniel, was standing 12 feet away refilling the chip bowl. We'd been married for 2 years at that point. My mother knew this. I remember smiling and saying nothing. I took a sip of my own champagne and walked back into the living room and put my hand on Daniel's back and pretended I hadn't heard a word. That was what I did back then. I absorbed things and I smiled and I pretended. It was a survival skill I'd been practicing since childhood, and by my late 20s I'd gotten very good at it. But that was before I understood what was actually happening. Before I understood that, while my family was busy comparing my husband to Brandon Walsh, like Brandon was some kind of gold standard, Daniel had quietly been watching something none of the rest of us had the sense to see. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the older of 2 daughters. My sister Leah is 3 years younger than me, and from the time we were small, she was the one people described as having that special something. She was prettier, yes, but more than that, she was magnetic in the way that made adults trust her immediately. My mother used to joke that Leah could sell sunscreen in Seattle. My father would laugh every time, like it was the best thing he'd ever heard. I was the quiet one, the steady one. I did well in school, got a nursing degree, worked long shifts at a hospital in Columbus where I'd lived my whole life. I didn't have Leah's flash, but I was good at my job and I liked my life. I started dating Daniel when I was 28. He was 31. He owned a small electrical contracting business, just himself and 2 other guys, doing residential and commercial work around the county. He drove a truck that was 7 years old, and he came home most nights with grease under his fingernails, and he made me laugh harder than anyone I'd ever met. My parents were polite about Daniel in the beginning, the way people are polite about things they plan to tolerate temporarily. My father shook his hand at the first dinner and asked thoughtful questions about his work, and my mother complimented his manners. It felt fine. I thought maybe it would stay fine. Then Leah met Brandon. Brandon Walsh was 38 when he swept into our family's orbit. He had his own wealth management firm, a condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows, a wardrobe that looked assembled by someone whose full-time job was his wardrobe. He was handsome in the kind of authoritative way that made my father stand up straighter when he entered a room. He talked about markets and portfolio diversification at dinner, and my father leaned forward the whole time, nodding, and afterward he said Brandon was one of the sharpest young men he'd ever met. At Christmas that year, Brandon arrived with a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. He helped my mother with her chair without being asked. He told my father he'd been reading his old college papers online, found them through some alumni archive, and thought his analysis of regional economic cycles was genuinely ahead of its time. My father laughed and went pink and called Leah lucky, right there at the table. I watched Daniel across the table carefully open his roll and butter it and say nothing. Later that night, in the car, I asked him how he was doing. "Fine," he said. "My dad got a little." "It's fine, Ruch." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your dad likes impressive things. Brandon's impressive. It's not a crime." I wanted to say something more. I wanted to tell him that I saw it and I was angry about it, and he deserved better than to be quietly diminished at my family's Christmas table. But instead, I squeezed his hand back and looked out the window and told myself it would pass. They'd see who Daniel really was eventually. Give it time. That was my second mistake. My first was not saying it out loud right then. For the next 3 years, Brandon became the fixed star around which my family's admiration orbited. He and Leah got engaged after 14 months and married in a ceremony at a vineyard in Napa that Brandon paid for entirely. He flew my parents out first class. He put them up in a suite. My mother sent me photos of the room and I could hear her amazement even through the phone screen. "He's just so generous," she told me. "Leah is so blessed." Daniel and I sent a gift from the registry and toasted them at the reception, and I danced with my husband until my feet hurt and tried not to think about the way my father had introduced us to someone earlier that evening. And this is our other daughter, Rachel. And her husband, he does electrical work. The way he said electrical work, the pause before it, Daniel hadn't flinched. He'd shaken the man's hand and said it was good to meet him. But I'd seen the slight tightening around his eyes. I knew him well enough to see it. I pulled my mother aside the next morning before we left the hotel. I told her I needed her to hear me say something. That Daniel was not less of a person because he worked with his hands. That I was proud of what he built, and how he ran his business, and who he was. That I needed her and my father to stop treating him like a consolation prize. My mother looked at me with this expression I can only describe as careful, like she was measuring how serious I was before she decided how to respond. Then she said, "Oh, honey, nobody thinks that. We love Daniel." And then she said, "I just hope you two are being smart about your finances. Brandon says the next few years are going to be volatile." That was the end of that conversation. Back home in Columbus, life continued in its normal shape. Daniel's business grew steadily. He hired a third full-time employee that spring and picked up a commercial contract with a new development going up on the east side. I picked up extra shifts when I could. We bought a house that needed work and Daniel did most of it himself. On weekends, teaching me things as he went. How to patch drywall. How to tell if a window is properly sealed. How to look at the bones of a space and see what it could become. I loved those weekends. I loved watching him move through a room with that complete calm competence, knowing exactly what he was doing, never performing it for anyone. Meanwhile, Brandon was everywhere. He started a financial podcast that my father subscribed to immediately. He was interviewed by a regional business magazine, and my mother framed the page and put it in the hallway. He bought Leah a bigger house in a suburb I'd always thought of as slightly too far to visit conveniently. And suddenly every family gathering happened there, in their kitchen, at their long table, with Brandon at the head of it pouring wine and telling stories. My father started asking Brandon's advice about his retirement portfolio. They had calls, regular calls, and my father would mention things Brandon had said with a reverence he'd once reserved for his own father. It made something twist in me, watching it, but I couldn't name exactly why until much later. The first time something felt off, I didn't recognize it as that. It was a Sunday in February, 2 years after Leah and Brandon's wedding. We were at their house for Daniel's birthday dinner, which Leah had insisted on hosting. Brandon was in a good mood, expansive, refilling glasses before they were empty. He made a toast and called Daniel the man who keeps the lights on, and everyone laughed. Daniel smiled. I smiled. I wrote it off. But I noticed that Daniel got quiet on the drive home. Quieter than usual. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "Nothing important," he said. Then, a moment later, "Brandon handles a lot of client money, right? Like individual investors, retirement accounts, that kind of thing?" I said yes. "Why?" "No reason," he said. "I'm just not sure I understand his business model." I didn't ask more. He didn't offer more. I thought it was probably just Daniel in his own head. The way he got sometimes when something mechanical wasn't sitting right with him, when something didn't add up and he was quietly turning it over. 3 months later, at a barbecue at my parents' house, my father mentioned casually that he'd moved the majority of his retirement savings into one of Brandon's managed funds. A specialized one, Brandon had explained. Better protection against the volatility he kept predicting. I looked at Daniel across the yard. He was talking to my uncle about something. He didn't look up, but later, when we were loading our car to leave, he said very quietly, without looking at me, "Do you know if your dad got any paperwork? Like documents from Brandon's firm, with the fund name, registration number?" I said I didn't know. I asked why. "I've been doing some reading," he said. "I want to make sure he's protected." I felt something then. Not quite alarm. Closer to the feeling you get when you're in a familiar building and suddenly one hallway doesn't look right. You can't say what's wrong, but something has shifted. I pushed it aside. I told myself Daniel was probably being protective in a general way, the way he got about things that mattered to him. 2 weeks later, he came home and sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and showed me what he'd found. Brandon's firm was registered. Everything looked legitimate on the surface. But the specific fund my father's money had gone into, and two others Daniel had been able to trace through public records, were not what Brandon had represented them as. The returns he'd been promising clients were not matching anything in the market. Daniel had spent his evenings cross-referencing filings, teaching himself to read the documents, asking a guy he'd done electrical work for, who turned out to have a background in financial compliance. The picture that was emerging was not good. I sat at the table and felt the room do something strange. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Since February," he said. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure enough to say something. "Daniel, I know. This is my family's money." "I know, Rach." He put his hand over mine. "I didn't want to scare you before I had something real. I'm sorry, but I needed to understand what I was looking at." I asked him what we should do. He said we needed to give my father a chance to pull the money out, and we needed to do it without tipping Brandon off, and we probably needed to call someone a real financial attorney, or the SEC. He said he had some names. That night I lay awake, trying to decide what version of this I was even prepared to say out loud. Because here was the problem. My family loved Brandon. My father trusted him completely. My mother had said more than once that Leah had made the smartest decision of her life. And Daniel, quiet, calm, drives. A 7-year-old truck. Daniel was about to walk into that with a folder full of documents and tell them they'd been wrong about everything. I thought about my mother at that hotel breakfast after Leah's wedding. I thought about every dinner where my father had talked to Brandon about markets while Daniel refilled water glasses. I thought about the toast, the man who keeps the lights on. I sat up in the dark, and I made a decision that I should have made years earlier. I was going to stand next to my husband while he did this. Not behind him, not waiting in the car, right next to him. We asked my parents to come to our house for dinner a week before Thanksgiving, just the 4 of us. Daniel made his mother's lasagna, and I made a salad, and I set the table carefully, and when they were both seated I looked at my mother and then at my father and said, "Dad, we need to talk to you about something, and I need you to hear us out before you say anything." My father looked at Daniel. Daniel held his gaze. "I've been doing some research on Brandon's fund," Daniel said. "The one you moved your retirement savings into in May. I want to show you what I found." My father's face went through 4 different expressions in about 2 seconds. I watched him land on something that looked like polite skepticism, the expression you'd give someone who was perhaps overreacting. "Daniel," he said, "Brandon is a licensed professional. I appreciate you looking out, but—" "Dad," I said it clearly, not unkindly but clearly, "please look at what Daniel is showing you." My mother touched my father's arm. He was quiet. He looked at the folder Daniel slid across the table. I watched my father read. I watched the skepticism change. I watched something underneath it begin to shift the way plates shift slowly, then all at once. He asked Daniel to explain 3 things. Daniel explained them without a trace of impatience or satisfaction. He was steady and plain and factual, the way he always was when he understood something completely. My mother reached across and put her hand over her mouth. By the end of dinner, my father had called his own bank to put a freeze on any further transfers. By the end of the week, he'd spoken to a financial attorney Daniel had already found for him. By the time Thanksgiving came, there were 2 other families who'd been clients of Brandon's that my father, with the attorney's guidance, had quietly connected with. Thanksgiving that year was at our house. I'd insisted on it, for the first time ever, and my parents had agreed without argument. Brandon didn't know yet what was coming. He arrived with wine and a pie from the nicest bakery in town and greeted my father with the same warm handshake he always used. I watched my father shake his hand and felt something I can only describe as enormous respect for my father in that moment because he was holding it together. He was being civil while carrying knowledge that could only feel like a kind of grief. Leah pulled me into the kitchen while the men talked in the living room. She looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes that I'd been attributing to her new job. But standing in the yellow light of my kitchen, I looked at my sister, and really looked, for maybe the first time in years. "Are you okay?" I asked. She started to say yes, and then she didn't. She set down the dish she was holding and said, "Things have been weird lately. Brandon's been stressed. He won't tell me why, but he's not sleeping." She looked at me. Do you know something? I took a breath. And then, for the second time in my life, instead of absorbing things and smiling and pretending, I told her the truth. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The sounds of the living room came through the wall. Then she said, I told her. She pressed her lips together. I watched her face do what my father's face had done layer by layer, something rearranging itself. She looked at the door to the living room. She looked at me. I think I knew something was wrong, she said very quietly. I didn't let myself look. I didn't say anything. I put my arm around her and she leaned into me the way she used to when we were kids and the world felt too large and complicated. Dinner was extraordinary in the way that only impossible situations can make an ordinary meal feel extraordinary. We passed food and told stories, and my nephew fell asleep on the couch before dessert, and Daniel carved the turkey like it was any other year. After the pie, when the kids were in the other room, my father did the thing I hadn't expected. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the one he'd been wearing all evening, and he slid a folder across the table to Brandon. I had not known he was going to do this at Thanksgiving dinner. I had thought we were waiting for the attorney to finish organizing everything. But my father looked at Brandon across his own son-in-law's table and said, quietly, I think you owe my family an explanation. Brandon opened the folder. I watched his face. It was like watching a building's power go out room by room, section by section, until there was nothing running. He tried 3 different versions of an explanation. Daniel, beside me, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The work was done. He had done it in the evenings for 9 months without telling anyone, without asking for credit, without using it for a single moment of vindication against all the years of being quietly looked past. Leah's attorney sent the filing papers in January. The SEC investigation was already open by then. My father's attorney had connected them with 2 additional families. The money, most of it, eventually came back, through a settlement process that took longer than anyone wanted, but ultimately worked. My sister moved back to Columbus by spring. She and Leah's girls spent so many weekends at our house that Daniel built a small climbing structure in the backyard, the kind with a slide and a little rope ladder, and assembled it in an afternoon. While the girls handed him bolts and asked him questions, he answered with complete seriousness, like their questions were the most reasonable things he'd ever heard. I stood at the kitchen window watching him with them and felt something settle in my chest. Something that had been slightly unsettled, I realized, for a long time. My mother came to stand beside me. She had a dish towel in her hands and she stood there looking out at the yard and she said, finally, I owe Daniel an apology. I looked at her. A real one, she said. Not a, she stopped, started again. I spent a long time being impressed by the wrong things. I didn't say I told you so. There was nothing in me that wanted to. I just said, he would appreciate hearing that. She nodded. She folded the dish towel in her hands. Once, twice. He's a good man, Rachel. Yes, I said. He is. That afternoon, when Daniel came inside to wash up, my mother was waiting at the kitchen sink. She said his name. He turned, and she said, I want to tell you something, and I hope you'll let me just say it. He leaned against the counter and looked at her with that same open attentiveness he'd always had, that thing about him that I'd loved from the beginning, the way he just listened, without preparing his response, without protecting himself, just completely there. She apologized. She said it plainly. She didn't make it about her or dress it up. She said she had undervalued him, and she was sorry for it. He said, I appreciate that. Thank you. That was all. He turned back to the sink and finished washing his hands, and then went to find my father to see if the back gutter was still pulling loose at the corner, the way it had been since Christmas. I heard my mother exhale behind me. And then I heard her laugh, soft and surprised. That was it? He just said thank you and moved on? That's Daniel, I said. She shook her head slowly, still smiling. I turned and looked at her. I know, I said. I've always known. What I've thought about a lot since then is that particular kind of blindness, the way we let surface impressions stack up into something we mistake for knowledge. Brandon dressed the part so completely and performed so fluently that my family never stopped to ask whether any of it was real. They never looked past the wine and the window seat condo and the effortless financial vocabulary to ask what any of it was built on. And meanwhile, Daniel, who'd never performed anything in his life, who showed up exactly as he was and offered exactly what he had, kept getting measured against a standard that was itself a fiction. I wasted years being quiet about it, years absorbing the small diminishments and telling myself they would pass, that my family would see what I saw eventually, that I didn't need to make it a confrontation. But silence has a cost. I know that now in a way I can't unknow. Every time I smiled and said nothing, I was telling Daniel, without meaning to, that maybe they had a point, that maybe their version of value was the right one, and he just wasn't meeting it. I was wrong. And I wasn't wrong in a small, forgivable way. I was wrong in the way that could have cost us something I wouldn't have known how to live without. We had dinner with my parents last month. My father spent 45 minutes asking Daniel about the new commercial project his crew is working on, a mixed-use development on the north side with some complicated grounding requirements. He asked actual questions. He listened to the answers. At one point he said, "I had no idea that much went into it," and he meant it genuinely. After dinner, driving home, Daniel reached over and turned the radio down. "That was nice," he said. "Yeah," I said. "It was." He drove for a while. "Your dad asked good questions." "He did." We stopped at a light. He looked over at me. "You doing okay?" It was such a Daniel thing to ask. After everything, after the years and the dinners and the comparisons and the toast about keeping the lights on, after 9 months of evenings at the kitchen table, teaching himself to read financial filings to protect a family that hadn't been particularly kind to him after all of it, the light turned red and he looked over and asked if I was doing okay. "Yes," I said. And then, because I was done being quiet about the things that mattered, I said, "I should have stood up for you sooner. A lot sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. The light changed. "You stood up when it counted," he said. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights and thought about my father at the table with that folder. My sister in the kitchen finally letting herself look. My mother at the window with the dish towel. The particular shape of a thing you could never go back and do differently, but could choose, from here, not to repeat. "I love you," I said. "I love you too, Rach." He turned the radio back up. We drove the rest of the way home in a comfortable quiet that I have learned, after enough years with him, to recognize as one of the best things I have ever been given. Not silence as absence. Silence as arrival. The kind you only get when you've stopped pretending and started paying attention to what was there all along.